The sound of the hand crank on a summer afternoon, that rhythmic grinding of rock salt against metal, children taking turns on the handle, and the promise that the first bowl belonged to whoever cranked the longest. Every black family reunion in the South had that freezer sitting in the grass. The ice cream that came out of it tasted nothing like what sits in a grocery store today. Nothing. Number 17 on this list was so simple it embarrassed store-bought vanilla into silence. Number 11 used a fruit most people today have never even tasted. And number 4 required an ingredient so old that the generation who knew how to use it is almost gone. These recipes disappeared when electric freezers replaced the hand crank, when sugar got cheap and cream got expensive, and when the women who held them in memory left this world without writing a single one down. Hit subscribe because these traditions deserve witnesses. Here are 25 lost ice cream recipes black grandmothers churned by hand. Number 25, buttermilk ice cream. This was never meant to be fancy. Leftover buttermilk from the morning biscuits, sugar, a little vanilla if the bottle had any left, and whatever cream could be spared. The tang of that buttermilk cut through the sweetness and left something sharp and clean on the tongue. It cost almost nothing to make. Grandmothers in Alabama and Mississippi churned this on weekday evenings when no occasion called for it, just because the buttermilk would turn if it sat another day. Nobody writes about it in cookbooks. It was too ordinary to be worth recording. That is exactly why it vanished. Number 24, sweet potato ice cream. Roasted sweet potatoes mashed smooth, folded into a custard base with cinnamon, nutmeg, and a pinch of clove. This tasted like Thanksgiving in a bowl. The color was deep gold. Families across the Carolina Low Country and Georgia made this in the fall when sweet potatoes came in heavy from the garden. There was no recipe card. You watched your grandmother press the potatoes through a sieve with the heel of her hand, and you remembered. When she passed, so did the exact ratio of spice to cream that made hers different from the neighbors. Number 23, molasses ice cream. Dark molasses, not the light kind, stirred into a cooked custard until the whole batch turned the color of wet clay. It had a bitterness underneath the sweet that children either loved or refused. This was a winter ice cream in houses where sugar was expensive and molasses came by the gallon from the general store. By the 1970s, when refined sugar cost less than $1 a bag, nobody reached for the molasses jug anymore. The flavor disappeared with the economics that made it necessary. Number 22, pecan praline ice cream. Not the store version with candy chunks. The original used homemade praline syrup cooked down in a cast iron pot until it smoked, then poured in a thin stream into the churning cream. The pecans were gathered from the yard, cracked on the porch, and toasted in the oven until they smelled like the whole fall condensed into one afternoon. Louisiana grandmothers guarded this method. The praline syrup had to hit the cream at exactly the right temperature, or it seized into hard candy. Number 21, lemon icebox ice cream. Fresh lemons squeezed until the juice ran clear, sugar dissolved in cream over low heat, and the whole thing churned fast before the acid could curdle the milk. This was the ice cream for church picnics when peaches were not yet ripe and nothing else was in season. The lemon made it feel lighter than it was, almost like drinking the cold lemonade through a spoon. Women in Tennessee and North Carolina knew that the secret was speed. You had to churn it the moment the lemon hit the cream. Wait too long, and the acid seized the fat and you had cottage cheese. Some women added a pinch of salt to slow the reaction. Others folded in a spoonful of condensed milk to stabilize the whole thing. Either way, the technique was learned through failure. Every woman who made lemon icebox ice cream could tell you about the first batch she threw behind the house. The good batch, though, tasted like summer itself. Sharp, bright, cold enough to make your teeth ache. It never kept well. By the next morning, it turned grainy and lost its edge. That was the point. You ate it the day it was made on a church lawn before the sun took it back. Number 20, blackberry ice cream. Wild blackberries, picked along fence rows and creek banks, strained through cheesecloth to catch the seeds, and stirred into a cream base that turned the color of a bruise. Picking those berries was a family job. Children came home with stained fingers and scratched arms. The ice cream was the reward. Deep South families made this in June and July when the berries came in so heavy they could not eat them all fresh. When those fence rows got bulldozed for subdivisions, the berry patches went with them. Number 19, egg custard ice cream. This was the foundation recipe, the one every other flavor built upon. 6 eggs, sometimes 8, beaten until pale, then cooked slowly with whole milk and cream over a double boiler until the mixture coated a wooden spoon. Vanilla bean, if the family could afford it, extract if they could not. The cooking required patience and a steady hand because the eggs would scramble if the heat climbed too fast. Grandmothers in every southern state made their own version of this custard, and no two tasted the same. The differences came down to how long you cooked the base, how much sugar you dared to add, whether you used all cream or stretched it with milk. Some women added a splash of bourbon to the base while it was still warm, just enough to round off the sweetness without making it a drink. Others dropped in a scraped vanilla pod and let it steep overnight before straining it out. This was the ice cream that showed up at funerals, at homecomings, at the table when the pastor came for Sunday dinner. It said, "This house has enough. This house can afford cream and eggs and time." When it sat on the table in a glass bowl with condensation running down the sides, it meant something beyond dessert. It meant abundance in a place where abundance was not guaranteed. The women who made it never called it egg custard ice cream. They just called it ice cream. Everything else was a variation. Number 18, banana ice cream. Overripe bananas, mashed with a fork until they turned to paste, folded into sweetened cream with a drop of vanilla. No chunks, smooth all the way through. This was Depression-era practical. Bananas that had gone too far for eating, skins blackened and soft, found a second life in the freezer. Children loved it because it tasted like banana pudding in frozen form. It asked nothing expensive of the family, just patience at the crank. The color came out pale yellow, almost ivory, and it had a creaminess that store-bought banana ice cream has never matched. That is because grocery store versions use artificial flavoring and food coloring to fake the fruit. The real thing needed only the fruit itself. Some grandmothers roasted the bananas in the oven first, bringing out a deeper, almost caramel sweetness that clung to the back of the tongue. Others mashed them raw and stirred in a teaspoon of lemon juice to keep the color from turning gray. In households where money was especially thin, banana ice cream stretched a single pint of cream into enough dessert for a whole table. The bananas did the heavy lifting. The cream was just the ride. Number 17, vanilla bean ice cream. Not vanilla extract. The actual bean, split with the paring knife, seeds, scraped into the warming cream. The smell filled the kitchen for hours. This was the version that embarrassed every carton in the frozen aisle. The difference between real bean and extract was the difference between a voice and an echo. Families saved vanilla beans for this one purpose. Some kept them in a jar of sugar all year long, so the sugar itself carried the flavor before it ever touched the cream. That jar does not exist in most kitchens anymore. Here is something that gets lost in the telling. Hand-churned ice cream was not a recipe. It was a technology. The wooden bucket, the metal canister, the dasher inside, the layers of ice and rock salt packed around it. Every family owned one of these machines or knew a neighbor who did. They cost almost nothing, lasted decades, and required only ice, salt, and human labor to operate. No electricity, no moving parts that could break. The only thing they could not survive was a generation that stopped using them. When electric ice cream makers arrived, the hand crank moved to the shed. When grocery stores started selling half gallons for a few dollars, the electric maker moved to the shelf above the refrigerator. And when the women who remembered the wooden bucket passed, the knowledge of what came out of it, the textures and temperatures and timings that no instruction manual could replicate, left the world with them. What replaced it was convenient. It was not the same. Number 16, fig ice cream. Ripe figs from the tree in the yard, cooked down with sugar into a thick jam, then swirled through the custard base. Figs do not ship well. They bruise if you look at them wrong. So this ice cream only existed where fig trees grew, and only in the 2 or 3 weeks of late summer when the fruit came ripe all at once. Mississippi, Alabama, South Georgia. Families who had a fig tree made this. Families who did not traded for it. When those yards got sold and the trees cut down, the recipe had nowhere left to live. Number 15, brown sugar ice cream. White sugar replaced with dark brown sugar, giving the cream a molasses undertone and a color like wet sand. Simpler than molasses ice cream and sweeter, with a caramel edge that clung to the roof of the mouth. This one survived longer than most because brown sugar remained cheap and available, but the hand-churned version, with its coarser texture and heavier body, disappeared when electric machines took over. The speed of the churn changes the crystal structure of the ice. A fast machine makes it smooth. A slow hand makes it dense. They are not the same dessert. Number 14, dewberry ice cream. Every June, the ditches and fence rows of the rural South turned dark with dewberries. They grew low to the ground, tangled in thorns that tore at bare legs and forearms, and the only people who picked them were the ones who knew they were worth the trouble. Black grandmothers sent children out with lard buckets at dawn before the heat softened the fruit into mush. The berries came back warm and already bleeding through the tin. Some women cooked them down with sugar into a thick, almost black syrup, straining out the seeds through flour sackcloth. Others crushed them raw and folded the pulp straight into the cream base, seeds and all, because that was how their mothers did it. The churn turned slow. The color came out somewhere between purple and midnight blue, darker than any ice cream you could buy in a store. The taste was sharp and wild, nothing like a cultivated blackberry. There was a bitterness underneath the sweet that reminded you this fruit came from the edge of the road, not from a farm. Children who ate it remembered the stained fingers and the scratched up arms as much as the flavor. It was a full body experience, from the picking to the cranking to the eating. The juice got into your clothes and never fully washed out, and the mothers knew it before they sent you out, and they sent you out anyway. The dewberry patches still grow along every back road in Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, the Carolinas. They fruit every summer without anyone asking. But the women who knew how to turn those thorny, fragile berries into something worth sitting on a porch for are fewer every year. The buckets do not go out at dawn anymore. The ditches keep their fruit, and the birds take what the sun does not spoil. Number 13, coconut ice cream. Fresh coconut, not the dried flakes from a bag. The whole shell cracked open with a hammer on the back porch. The meat grated by hand on a box grater. The milk pressed out through a clean kitchen towel. That fresh coconut milk went straight into the cream base, the shredded meat folded in at the end. It took the better part of an afternoon to prepare a single batch. The store made it unnecessary. A can of coconut milk replaced the hammer and the grater and the towel, and then nobody bothered anymore. Number 12, cane syrup ice cream. In sugarcane country, Louisiana, and parts of East Texas and coastal Georgia, families had access to fresh pressed cane syrup from local mills. They used it the way others use sugar, pouring it directly into the cream base and letting the mineral sweetness of raw cane do the work. This ice cream had a depth that white sugar could never reach. It tasted like the earth it grew in. When the small mills shut down and cane syrup became a specialty item on a grocery shelf, the recipe lost its reason for existing. Number 11, muscadine ice cream. Muscadine grapes grow wild across the South, thick-skinned, musky, sweet enough to make your teeth ache. Grandmothers cooked them down into a pulp, strained out the skins and seeds, and stirred that purple concentrate into the ice cream base. The flavor was nothing like a grocery store grape. It was wilder, deeper, almost perfumed. Most people under 40 today have never tasted a muscadine grape at all. They grow in places nobody walks anymore, along old property lines and abandoned fence posts. The fruit falls and rots where it lands. There is a reason none of these recipes appear in the cookbooks that claim to document Southern food. The women who made them did not measure. They poured until it looked right. They tasted and adjusted. They knew by the sound of the crank when the ice cream was thickening, by the resistance in the handle when it was almost done. This was knowledge held in the body, not on paper. And the food writers who came through the South looking for recipes to publish, they went to restaurants, they went to professional kitchens. They did not sit on the back porch of a house in rural Mississippi and watch a grandmother pour cane syrup into a metal canister by a field. That knowledge was never collected because nobody with a publishing contract thought it was worth collecting. Now it is gone, and what remains are imitations. Store-bought versions named after what these women made but bearing no resemblance to it. The names survived, the craft did not. Number 10, peanut ice cream. Roasted peanuts ground to a rough paste in a mortar, stirred into sweetened cream, not peanut butter from a jar. The homemade paste had a graininess to it, a texture that caught between the teeth and released salt and oil in waves. This was common in Georgia and Alabama, where peanuts grew in backyard gardens. The cost was nothing. A handful of peanuts, cream from the morning milk, sugar from the pantry. It was poor food dressed up for company. When commercial peanut butter arrived on shelves, the mortar went into the cabinet and stayed there. Number 9, honey ice cream. Raw honey from a local beekeeper, never heated, stirred cold into cream that had been barely sweetened. The honey kept its floral character that way. Different beekeepers meant different flavors. Clover honey made it delicate. Wildflower made it bold. Sourwood honey from the Appalachian foothills made it taste like something from another century entirely. There was a thickness to it that regular sweetened ice cream never had. The honey gave the finished product a chewiness, a resistance against the spoon, almost like pulling taffy in slow motion. This was the ice cream that required a relationship. You had to know somebody who kept bees, a jar exchanged at the back door or left on the porch with a note. That jar determined what the ice cream tasted like more than any other ingredient. 2 houses on the same road could make honey ice cream on the same afternoon, and the flavors would be entirely different because the bees worked different flowers. When the beekeepers aged out and nobody replaced them, the specific honeys they produced and the ice cream those honeys made possible disappeared together, The flavor was never in the recipe. It was in the field the bees worked and the hands that pulled the frames. Number 8, persimmon ice cream. Wild persimmons, not the large Asian variety from the grocery store. The small native ones that grew along creek banks and had to be dead ripe before they lost their mouth-puckering tannins. Grandmothers knew exactly when they were ready. A day too early and the astringency would ruin the whole batch. A day too late and the birds would take them. The window was narrow. The pulp went through a colander to catch the seeds, then folded into cream. It tasted like autumn distilled into sugar. Almost nobody makes this today because almost nobody knows where the persimmon trees are anymore. Number 7, caramel ice cream, not caramel sauce drizzled over vanilla. The caramel was the ice cream, dry sugar cooked in a heavy pot until it turned dark amber, almost burnt. Then cream poured in with a hiss and a cloud of steam that smelled like smoke and sweetness at once. That mixture cooled, then went into the churn. The result was ice cream the color of a paper bag with a bitterness at the back of the throat that balanced the sugar perfectly. This required nerve. The sugar had to go dark enough to taste like something, but not so dark it turned to charcoal. The women who made this had burned enough batches to know the exact shade of amber by sight. They stood over that pot without flinching when the steam hit. This was not a recipe for the timid. A moment of hesitation, pulling the pot too early, and you got something bland. A moment too late, and the whole kitchen filled with the smell of burnt sugar, and you started over. The pot itself held a record of every attempt. Decades of caramelized sugar baked into the iron, darkening it layer by layer until the pot looked scorched, even when it was clean. Some women refused to use any other pot, convinced the seasoning made a difference. Maybe it did. Grandmothers in Louisiana and Mississippi made this for Christmas. It showed up once a year because it demanded that kind of attention, the kind you could only afford to give on a day when nothing else competed for your time. When those women stopped making it, nobody in the family dared to try. They had seen the burns. They had smelled the failures. The courage to stand over a pot of liquid sugar at 400 degrees belonged to a generation that did not flinch. Number 6, sorghum ice cream. Sorghum syrup was the sweetener of the rural Black South before sugar became cheap. Thick, dark, with a mineral edge like iron. Poured into cream, it made something that looked like chocolate ice cream, but tasted like nothing else on earth. The sweetness hit different. It carried a tang underneath, almost like molasses, but grassier, greener, because it came from a cane plant and not a beet. Families who grew their own sorghum cane and pressed it at community mills made this every harvest season. The pressing was its own event. The mule walked in circles. The cane fed through the rollers. The juice ran into copper kettles and boiled for hours until it thickened into syrup. Children stood around the kettles, waiting to scrape the foam off the top with a stick, eating the hot, sweet froth before it cooled. The ice cream that came from this syrup tasted like the whole process. You could taste the field and the fire and the afternoon in every spoonful. The mills are mostly gone now. The syrup comes in small jars at specialty prices. What once cost a family nothing but labor now costs enough to make it impractical. The flavor survives in bottles on boutique shelves, but the ice cream it made has not followed it there. Number 5, watermelon ice cream. Not sorbet, not sherbet. Ice cream. The juice of a dead ripe watermelon, seeds strained out, cooked down on a low flame until it thickened into a concentrate too sweet and too pink to come from anything but August. That reduction went into the churn with a light hand on the cream, just enough to carry the texture. The melon did the talking. It took hours to reduce enough juice for a single batch, standing over a pot in the kitchen that was already unbearable. When store-bought ice cream showed up for pocket change, nobody volunteered for that vigil again. The flavor disappeared not because anyone forgot it, but because nobody had the afternoon to spare. Number 4, Maypop ice cream. Maypop is the wild passion flower native to the South. The fruit is small, wrinkled, and sour enough to make your whole face contract. But cooked with sugar and strained, it became a syrup with a tropical sharpness that tasted like nothing else growing in American soil. Grandmothers who knew where the vines grew gathered the fruit in late summer and made small batches of ice cream that family members talked about for years. Most people alive today have never heard the word maypop. The vines still grow along roadsides and old fences. The fruit drops unpicked. Number 3, strawberry ice cream with fresh picked berries. Not the frozen kind, not the syrup kind. Strawberries picked that morning from a patch in the yard, still warm from the sun, crushed with a fork and stirred into cream that had been sweetened barely enough to let the fruit speak. The hand-churned version kept the berries in pieces large enough to bite. The ice crystals formed around the fruit like frost on a window. A modern machine pulverizes them into uniform pink. The hand crank was gentler. It let the strawberry stay a strawberry. Some women sugared the berries first and let them sit for an hour until they released their own juice, a technique called macerating, though nobody used that word. They just said they let the berries weep. That liquid, bright red and thick with dissolved sugar went into the cream along with the fruit. It dyed the ice cream in uneven streaks, so each scoop looked different from the last. There was no measuring. The amount of fruit depended on how the patch had done that year. A good spring meant strawberry ice cream so loaded with berries it barely held together. A lean spring meant stretching half a bowl of fruit across a full batch of cream and hoping nobody noticed. They always noticed. Number 2, eggnog ice cream. The Christmas eggnog that had been spiked and spiced and left in the icebox overnight poured the next morning into the hand crank with a little extra cream. Nutmeg heavy on top. This was the day after Christmas ice cream, when the house still smelled like pine and the children were home and nobody had anywhere to be. It used what was already made. It wasted nothing. And it tasted like the holidays stretched into one more afternoon. The bourbon or whiskey in the eggnog kept the texture softer than plain ice cream. It never froze as hard, so it came off the dasher almost like soft serve, loose and rich and cold. Grandmothers who made this understood something about timing that had nothing to do with cooking. They knew that the day after the celebration, when the excitement had passed and the house was quieter, was when people needed sweetness the most. So they cranked the leftover eggnog into ice cream and set it on the table without announcement. It arrived like a second holiday inside the first one. Nobody makes day after Christmas ice cream anymore. There is no leftover eggnog in a house that buys it by the quart and drinks it all on the day. The surplus is gone, and with it, the tradition that depended on it. Number 1, the recipe that was never written down. Every family had one. The grandmother who would not share her measurements. The aunt who said she would teach the girls when they were old enough, and then time ran out before old enough arrived. It was not one specific recipe. It was the principle that a recipe lived in a person, not on paper. That person was the recipe. And when she left, the flavor left with her. It was the way she held the spoon, the speed at which she cranked, the sound she waited for, a change in pitch that meant the ice cream was setting, that she heard the way a musician hears a note go flat. You cannot write that down. You cannot measure a sound. You can write down cups and teaspoons, but you cannot record the way a woman tilted the pot to check the color against the light or the exact moment she decided the custard was done. That knowledge lived in her hands and her ears and her sense of time, and it died quietly on an ordinary afternoon when nobody was paying attention, not lost to history, lost to a single afternoon when nobody thought to sit down and ask. That is the one that keeps people up at night. Not any single flavor on this list, but the silence where it used to be. If the church potluck had one certainty, it was that somebody's grandmother had brought the sour cream pound cake, and the pan would be empty before the table was cleared. This was not the dry, crumbling version from a box. It was dense and moist in a way only a full cup of sour cream could produce, the acid reacting with the baking soda to give the crumb a tenderness that lasted 3 days. African American home bakers in the 1950s and 60s understood that sour cream was the difference between a pound cake that tasted good and one that tasted like it had been made by someone who genuinely knew what they were doing. No frosting on a sour cream pound cake. The golden crust was the entire presentation. She baked it in a tube pan, set it upside down on the neck of a bottle to cool, and you could not slice it warm no matter how much you wanted to. These women knew their ovens without a thermometer, by how the kitchen smelled, by when that browned butter sweetness filled the whole house. Long before beignets became the face of New Orleans, Black women walked the French Quarter at dawn carrying covered baskets, calling out in Creole, "Beautiful callus, still hot." These rice fritters were made from leftover cooked rice mixed with yeast, eggs, sugar, flour, and nutmeg, fried in deep lard until golden and dusted heavy with powdered sugar. The word traces to West African languages, the Yoruba akara and Nupe kara, both meaning fried cake, carried across the Atlantic by enslaved people who adapted the recipe to Louisiana rice. Under Spanish colonial rule, enslaved people could purchase their freedom, and callus became one of the ways Black women earned that price, selling fritters penny by penny. By the 1940s, only a handful of callus women remained. The beignet pushed them aside, no overnight yeast rise needed. A dessert that once bought people their freedom barely survives now in a few Creole cookbooks and the memories of families who remember the taste. Number 23, peach cobbler. If you grew up in a Black household in the South, you remember the sound of peach cobbler before you remember the taste, the bubbling, the crust cracking in the oven. Black mothers made cobbler from fresh peaches in summer and canned peaches in winter. The crust was biscuit dough, sometimes rolled, sometimes dropped in rough spoonfuls on top of the fruit. Sugar, cinnamon, nutmeg, a little vanilla, a generous amount of butter. That was the whole recipe. In rural Georgia and Mississippi, families picked peaches from trees in their yards. There was no cost. In the cities, a can of peaches cost 15 cents. A cobbler fed 8. Your mother did not need a cookbook for this. She needed a deep pan, a hot oven, and enough butter to make the crust golden. They were following a memory. Egg custard pie was the dessert you made when the pantry was nearly empty and company was still coming. 5 ingredients: eggs, milk, sugar, vanilla, and nutmeg grated fresh over the top. That was the entire recipe, and it was enough. In African American households from the 1930s through the 60s, this pie appeared at Sunday dinner because it required no special shopping and no hours at the stove. The filling poured into an unbaked crust, and the oven transformed it into a trembling golden custard that held its shape when sliced but yielded completely on the tongue. She knew it was done when the center barely jiggled. That reading of the oven could not come from a cookbook. The nutmeg was always freshly grated, never from a tin, because pre-ground spice bore no resemblance to what came off a whole nutmeg directly onto the custard. The elders kept one wrapped in a cloth in the spice drawer. If you asked what it was for, they handed it to you and pointed at the pie. Fried peach hand pies were the kind of dessert you smelled before you saw the plate. Dried peaches simmered to a thick, sweet pulp, spooned onto rounds of biscuit dough, folded shut, and slid into a cast iron skillet of hot lard. In North Carolina, folks called them peach jacks, and the name alone could start a family argument. The secret was always dried fruit, never fresh. Families hung peach slices on strings in late summer until they shriveled into chewy ribbons of concentrated sweetness. You knew the oil was right by the sound, a sharp crackle the instant the edge hit the surface. Black cooks across Georgia and the Carolinas wrapped these in wax paper for field workers and packed them into baskets for church homecomings. They traveled north during the Great Migration, tucked into suitcases for long train rides. You can find versions at gas stations now, but they carry none of the warmth. The ones she fried with peaches she dried herself and dough she mixed by feel. Those disappeared the morning she stopped getting up early enough to make them. Number 21, pound cake. Every black mother in the 1960s had a pound cake recipe, and every one of them believed hers was the best. The original formula was simple: 1 pound of butter, 1 pound of sugar, 1 pound of eggs, 1 pound of flour. That was it. No baking powder, no baking soda. The rise came from beating the eggs long enough to trap air in the batter. Your mother stood at the counter and creamed butter and sugar by hand with a wooden spoon for 15 minutes until her arm ached. The cake baked low and slow, sometimes for an hour and a half. A good pound cake was dense, moist, and golden. It did not need frosting. It sat on a plate under a glass dome, and it was the first thing offered to anyone who walked through the front door. In the black church, pound cake was currency. That cake was proof that someone in the house knew how to bake. The lemon icebox pie sat on the second shelf of the refrigerator, covered with a dish towel, and you knew better than to touch it before Sunday dinner was over. This no-bake custard pie became a fixture in African-American kitchens once refrigerators became standard in the 1950s and 60s. The crust was crushed vanilla wafers pressed in with the heel of a hand, never graham crackers, because the wafer crust was softer and richer. The filling was 3 things: condensed milk, fresh lemon juice, and egg yolks whisked together until they thickened from the acid alone. She chilled it for 3 hours and finished it under the broiler with a meringue that browned at the peaks. She never measured the juice. You watched her hands and counted the lemons yourself, hoping to carry that knowledge forward. Most daughters got close. Nobody got it exactly right. When bananas turned black on the counter, too soft for slicing, too sweet for anything sensible, that was exactly when they became perfect. Fried banana fritters took overripe fruit and turned it into something golden, crisp, and impossibly rich. Mashed into batter with flour, a beaten egg, sugar, and cinnamon, then dropped in rounds into hot lard. The natural sugars caramelized against the oil, creating edges that crackled into the warm center. Caribbean influence ran deep. Plantain fritter versions existed across the islands, and as families from Jamaica and Trinidad settled in southern port cities during the 1940s and 50s, those recipes merged with African-American frying traditions already old. Some cooks added vanilla. Others drizzled brown sugar dissolved in butter over the top. The whole thing cost almost nothing and used fruit headed for the trash, resourceful and indulgent in the same bite. Number 20, bread pudding. This was the dessert that said, nothing in this kitchen goes to waste. Black mothers saved stale bread all week. White bread, biscuits, cornbread, dinner rolls, whatever had gone dry by Friday got torn into pieces and soaked in a mixture of eggs, milk, sugar, vanilla, and cinnamon. Some added raisins, some added a spoonful of bourbon. The pan went into the oven and came out golden and puffed, soft in the center and crisp along the edges. A full pan cost almost nothing because the main ingredient was food that would have been thrown away. In a house where every dollar mattered, that was not just a dessert, That was engineering. Your grandmother did not call it bread pudding. She called it making do. Banana bread in the 1960s was not a weekend project. It was Tuesday morning when the bunch on the counter had gone too dark to eat, and throwing them away was not something that happened in that kitchen. Black families across the South and the urban North, still close to the rationing habits of the war years, treated overripe bananas as an ingredient, not a problem. The blackened fruit had converted its starch to sugar and carried a caramel-rich depth that no fresh banana could match. She mashed them with a fork, stirred in butter, eggs, flour, and a fistful of brown sugar. If there were walnuts in the cabinet, they went in. The brown, sugar glaze poured while the loaf was still hot made the top go glossy and cracked slightly as it cooled. The first slice was eaten standing at the counter before the loaf ever reached the table. Today, that same loaf sells for $8 in a coffee shop. Back then, it was what you made so nothing went to waste. She mashed them while they were still hot. Sweet potatoes pulled from the oven, skins splitting, steam rising off the orange flesh. Mixed with flour, a crack of egg, nutmeg, grated fresh, and just enough sugar to let the potato lead. Fried sweet potato cakes had roots running to West Africa, where similar fritters called puff-puff were fried in palm oil at open markets. In the American South, the technique adapted to what grew in black family gardens: sweet potatoes by the bushel, shaped by hand, flattened into thick patties, and fried in lard until the edges crisped into a caramel dark crust, while the center stayed soft. The key was never over-mixing. You wanted flexi potato in every bite. Sprinkled with cinnamon and served hot, they showed up at Sunday tables and after church gatherings. By the 1980s, boxed mixes replaced from scratch frying, and these quiet cakes slipped off the table without anyone asking for the recipe until it was too late. Number 22, tea cakes. These were not fancy, they were not decorated. They were simple, round, slightly sweet cookies that black mothers baked by the dozen for Sunday visits, church picnics, and any afternoon when the children needed something before supper. Tea cakes date back to the 1700s, when enslaved people created their own version of European confections using the ingredients they had: flour, butter, sugar, eggs, vanilla, and a pinch of nutmeg. The recipes were never written down. They passed from mother to daughter by feel. You knew the dough was right when it felt like your grandmother's dough. A woman named Polly Ann Jackson in Tyler, Texas, made tea cakes her entire life and eventually started a business selling them. She used the same recipe her grandmother had used during Reconstruction. Tea cakes are one of the oldest desserts in Black American cooking, passed down generation after generation, and almost nobody under 40 makes them anymore. You had never seen a cake with something hidden inside it until she made the sock it to me cake, and once you did, you understood that baking could have secrets. The name came straight from the era, lifted from Aretha Franklin's 1967 hit Respect, then spread wide by the comedy show Rowan and Martin's Laugh In. Duncan Hines printed a version on the back of a boxed mix, and Black Southern bakers built something far better from scratch. The cake was a dense sour cream pound cake, but the inside held the revelation: a swirl of brown sugar, cinnamon, and chopped pecans that stayed hidden until you cut the first slice. She mixed the streusel by hand, pressed it into the center of the batter, and covered it with the remaining cake. A thin vanilla glaze ran into the grooves when it came out of the bundt pan. Church potlucks, family reunions, holiday tables, this cake showed up and showed out. Women who brought it were asked for the recipe. They said it was simple. It was. Knowing what to put inside was the whole point. Before donuts came in boxes, there were molasses, dough balls, small rounds of flour, egg, and dark molasses dropped by the spoonful into shimmering lard. They puffed golden and crisp outside while staying dense and chewy within, carrying the smoky sweetness only blackstrap molasses could give. During the Depression, when white sugar was beyond reach for most black households in the rural South, molasses kept dessert alive. A jar cost almost nothing and stretched further than anything in the pantry. Mothers in Alabama and Mississippi fried batches on Saturday afternoons, rolling the hot balls in whatever sugar they had. Sometimes brown, sometimes raw cane, sometimes nothing, because the molasses was sweet enough alone. Kids lined up at the stove with outstretched palms, burning fingers and not caring. What started as a way to make something from almost nothing became the treat kids begged for even when the pantry was full. Number 24, banana pudding. There was a time when banana pudding showed up at every church supper, every family reunion, and every repast in the black community. The kind your mother made in a glass baking dish with layers of Nilla wafers. Sliced bananas, homemade vanilla custard cooked on the stove, and meringue browned in the oven. The Nabisco Company started printing a banana pudding recipe on its box in the 1940s. But black mothers had been making their own versions long before that. The custard was cooked slowly on a low flame, stirred constantly so it would not scorch. A single pan fed 20 people at a church picnic and cost less than $1. In your grandmother's kitchen, banana pudding was not a recipe, it was a language. It said, "Welcome home." It said, "Happy birthday," without needing a single candle. Before the canning shelf ran out in February, there was always at least one jar of applesauce left, and that jar became the applesauce spice cake. Not a substitute, but a recipe that made the fresh apple version seem unnecessary. This cake traced its American roots to colonial kitchens where applesauce replaced fat in the batter during times of scarcity. African American families in the rural South kept the tradition alive because apple trees grew in the yard and what they put up in summer lasted through winter. She never measured the spices, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, allspice, only shook until the batter turned the right shade of brown. Raisins went in if there were raisins, walnuts if there were walnuts. The cake baked in a square pan, served plain, never frosted. It tasted better the second day and better still the third as the spices deepened and the crumb tightened into something close to what she had intended all along. If those peach pies belonged to summer, fried apple turnovers owned the fall. The apples were always dried, never fresh. Dried fruit concentrated the flavor into something candy-like and held together without turning to mush. Families sliced their own from backyard trees each September, stringing them above the wood stove to cure. The dough was simple: flour, lard, salt, cold water, rolled thin and cut with the rim of a coffee cup. A spoonful of stewed apples in the center, edges crimped with a fork, and the whole thing slid into lard so hot it sealed the crust on contact. You never pierced the dough before frying. A single hole meant the filling leaked and the oil went dark. Kids learned that rule before they learned to read. These traveled in coat pockets to school, in baskets to church, in paper sacks to funerals. 25 recipes. Not one of them required a store-bought mix. Not one of them asked for artificial flavor or stabilizer or guar gum. They asked for cream, sugar, fruit from the yard, and a hand on the crank. They asked for time. That is what killed them. Not taste, not preference, time. The modern world decided that ice cream should take 30 seconds to acquire and cost nothing in effort. The trade was invisible at first, but 3 generations later, the gap between what sits in a freezer and what came out of a wooden bucket on a July afternoon is so wide that most people alive today have never tasted the real thing. They do not know what they lost. 25 recipes that lived in hands, not in books. Peach ice cream timed to a tree. Caramel that required nerve. Muscadine grape from a vine nobody walks past anymore. If any of these sat on your grandmother's table, you already know what was lost. Make one this summer. Pick the peaches, or crack the coconut, or find the persimmon tree. Put a child's hand on the crank. That is how it survives. Drop the flavor your family made in the comments, the one nobody else's grandmother got quite right, because somewhere, someone else remembers it too.